evening, everyone. Welcome to the Washington, D.C. headquarters of the American Society for Microbiology, to our Microbes After Hours program. The American Society for Microbiology is the largest single life science society in the world and the oldest. We have 40,000 members, which is a lot of microbiologists, but not really that many when you consider that our other constituency, the microbial world, is really large. So large that every one of you brought in about 10 trillion of that constituency into this room tonight. So we have a lot of organisms to speak for here. We're thrilled to have you here for the next round of our Microbes After Hours program. I'd like to just introduce the people who make this possible. Shannon Green, who is with the Academy. She puts this all together. She's going to be also fielding questions from our online audience and from Twitter. Chris Kandayan from the Communications Department, who somehow makes this all like go out into the internet and show up on YouTube and all that stuff. And Ray Ortega, who's our cameraman. Garth Hogan, who checked you all in and who publicizes this program. Tonight, we are going to be talking about bad microbes. But you all know that they are the exception, and that most microbes are at most neutral and often beneficial. So I just want to make sure that we're not profiling here the microbial world. But tonight we're going to talk about, and I should say that when bad microbes combine with bad people, then you've got a really big problem. And that's what we're going to be talking about in part tonight as well. We will be taking questions after each of the talks, and we'll be taking questions from our online audience. Hello, online audience, and audience of the future, because this will be archived and available for people to look at after tonight is over. People who weren't lucky enough to watch it live, they won't be able to ask questions, at least not with current technology, but we will be taking questions from the online audience later. So let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Dr. Marshall Bloom. He's an MD, and he's chief of the tick-borne flavivirus pathogenesis section. Big words. At the Rocky Mountain National Laboratory. And he is also the, sorry, let me find my place here. The Associate Director for Scientific Management at the Rocky Mountain National Lab. He's an expert on the pathogenesis of tick-borne flaviviruses, persistent infections, and parvoviruses. He's also on the editorial board of the journal Virology. And he played a major role in the design, construction, and staffing of the Rocky Mountain Laboratory BSL-4 facility, which was NIAID's first BSL-4 facility. He's an authority on biosafety, biocontainment, and management of high containment laboratory research programs, and also a historian of science. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about a yellow fever outbreak in 1793 in Philadelphia, which is where our government was based at that time because Washington, D.C. was too hot and humid, a problem that has since been solved. Marshall?
Well, as Mark Twain said, I'm struck speechless by that complimentary thunderbolt. And I just want to thank you for the wonderful opportunity to participate in this great program. And it was a lot of fun working with Shannon, putting together a program on microbes that shut the government down. And an appropriate time of the year and an appropriate venue for a couple of talks on that. And a couple of things before I start. First of all, I'm a little bit daunted. There's a lady in the front row here with a bag that says the History Channel, and I'm not a historian, so please don't blame me for too many historical inaccuracies. I also don't work on yellow fever, so if Tom Monath or any of the other yellow fever gurus in the world are in the audience, I hope I don't say too much bad, too many errant things about yellow fever. And finally, I guess I have to say that whenever Madonna puts on a performance, there's always an opening act to sort of soften up the crowd and act as an introduction. And although some of you may fail to see the resemblance between Doug Beecher and Madonna, my pleasure to be to speak right before him. He's going to tell us some really interesting stuff too. I want to tell you a little bit of history, a story that I kind of uncovered by accident, and I have to say that I uncovered it by accident, but a lot of other people over the last several hundred years have uncovered it on purpose. And I'm the beneficiary of all their research and expertise, but I'm going to try to spin a little story for you to just sort of give you an idea of the role that yellow fever played in the early years of our republic. Yellow fever is a virus infection. It's thought to have emerged in Central Africa, spread to West Africa, and then been transported to South America in the early 15th or 16th century. And the medical record keeping and the forensic microbiology in those years was not what it is today, but it's thought that as early as the mid-1600s there were some outbreaks in Mexico which may very well have been yellow fever, including one which was described as black vomit. And yellow fever is a hemorrhagic fever, very, very similar in its clinical manifestations to infections like Ebola virus. And that's one point. The other point is the way it got introduced into the United States is probably similar to the way yellow fever got brought into the United States inadvertently in a mosquito. So that's, I think, and the picture on the side of the slide there shows some of the primary findings in people with yellow fever: headache, muscle aches, and it's called yellow fever because basically your liver quits working and you become jaundiced. It was known variously as yellow jack, the American plague, the saffron scourge, and bronze John. And there were severe epidemics in the Western Hemisphere in the 18th and 19th century, all up and down the Western Hemisphere: the Caribbean, Cuba, and Haiti, the East Coast, Norfolk and Philadelphia, the Mississippi River Valley, New Orleans, Vicksburg, Memphis, and St. Louis. And at the end, I'll tell you about a book about one of the outbreaks in the Mississippi River Valley, which is really, really a cool book to read. And then also in Panama, and in fact, the French effort to construct a canal through Central America was defeated because of yellow fever and malaria. The two culprits in this infectious disease are the mosquito, Aedes aegypti, picture of which is on the left-hand side of the slides enlarged, and then the virus below that, the yellow fever virus, which is a member of the flaviviruses, the same family as caused dengue and, in fact, West Nile virus. And it was actually U.S. Surgeon Walter Reed who confirmed that that yellow fever was carried by mosquito after it had been predicted a few years previous to that by a Cuban physician, Carlos Finney. There was a 1905 epidemic of yellow fever in New Orleans, which was actually halted by a very serious mosquito control program, which is said to have been the definitive demonstration to culture at large that yellow fever was in fact vector-borne. A vaccine was developed by the noted virologist Max Tyler in the mid-1930s, and the vaccine that people get today, if you're going to go visit endemic areas in Africa, still based on that same virus strain 17D. And it's estimated that over 500 million doses of that vaccine have been delivered since that time, and looking at the audience here, I suspect a fair number of us have received that vaccine. But what I want to tell you about is to backcast a little bit to the Philadelphia outbreak back in 1793, and a quote from a congressman at that point, a guy named Samuel Breck. "I had scarcely become settled in Philadelphia when in July 1793 the yellow fever broke out, and spreading rapidly in August obliged all the citizens who could remove to seek safety in the country. The wealthy soon fled, the fearless or indifferent remained from choice, the poor from necessity. From the 1st to the 12th of October, 1,000 people died." So this was pretty serious. Just to set the stage a little bit, in 1793, Philadelphia was the temporary capital of the United States. The legislation enabling the District of Columbia had only recently been passed, and the government actually didn't move to the District of Columbia until around 1800. And although Philadelphia was a temporary capital, the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the United States, it's actually a very, very compact city at that time. The Delaware River on this side right here, and the other river, which I'm not sure how to pronounce, the Schuylkill River on that side. The population of that city at that time was about 50,000. That year, there was a rainy May, which followed a mild winter and preceded a hot, very dry summer. And if you read the historical accounts of that year, there were a lot of mosquitoes. A number of the authors noted that. And there was also an influx of several thousand refugees, French colonial refugees from Santo Domingo early on in that spring. The first cases of disease were observed in early August among immigrants near Arch Street. And Arch Street is this street right there, which was also called Mulberry Street. And I don't know if that's the same Mulberry Street as in the children's book or not. The first cases, anyway, were noted among some of those immigrants in the Arch Street area near the wharf. And Benjamin Rush, who at that time was regarded as the country's foremost and most prominent physician, took care of some of these early cases, and on August 19th, he recognized what was going on from previous experience he had as the highly contagious bilious remitting yellow fever. And he implicated as the cause of this putrefied coffee, which was going to waste on the wharf at Arch Street. So much for being the most prominent physician in the United States. And then over the course of the next couple of months, the deaths continued to really skyrocket through the month of August and through the month of October, such that it's estimated about 5,000 people ultimately ended up dying from this yellow fever outbreak. And the map on the left, at the top left of the slide, sort of shows the redder it is, the worse it was. Sort of shows you where the cases were located, and they did, in fact, primarily the farther away from the river you were, the better off things were. It consists, obviously, we know in retrospect that since this was a mosquito-borne infection, the onset of cold weather led to the end of the epidemic when the mosquitoes were killed. And it was estimated that the epidemic began around the 1st of August and then was over pretty much by the first week of November. About 5,000 people died, and almost half the population of the city left. And there were, one of the features which turns out I think is kind of interesting, there were hundreds of kids that were orphaned by this outbreak. The community's response was really pretty interesting. The mayor, who was the real hero in this outbreak in Philadelphia, because as you'll see, the federal government left town, the state government left town, but the mayor, Matthew Clarkson, asked Dr. Rush to work with the College of Physicians, which was located in Philadelphia at that time, to draft a report on what was going on with some recommendations. And some of those recommendations, some of them are a little quaint, and others of them we would probably still agree with. You should avoid, their recommended, there were a total of 11, I don't have them all cited here, to avoid infected people, to avoid getting too tired, use the generous use of vinegar and camphor, the sick houses in which people were sick should be marked, the street should be cleaned, which many people commented on later, and you were supposed to burn gunpowder. And the mayor adopted these recommendations, and he published the report in late August, and then he formed a mayor's committee, which really ended up dealing with this outbreak in Philadelphia in a lot of different ways. And that part of it was really, really interesting. If you're interested in this, you should definitely read some of the books about this, about the way the community responded, and the committee that was formed, and who was on that committee, and the different roles where they just sort of took the ball and ran with it. One of the interesting things was that African Americans were thought to be resistant to this infection, and they were actually enlisted, members of the Free African Society were enlisted to assist with care and nursing of some of the people who were seriously ill. Of course, it turned out they weren't naturally resistant to this, and a temporary hospital was established out of the main part of Philadelphia where a lot of the patients, especially the poor ones, were sent and taken care of. And it turns out that one of the features which helped to allay panic during this outbreak was Dr. Rush's great self-confidence in his own abilities to understand what was going on and to treat it. There were a number of controversies associated with this outbreak at this time, and I think both in etiology and in treatment. Rush felt that the cause was noxious effluvia arriving from local putrefactions, i.e. garbage, filth, and decaying coffee on the wharfs. Others, and there were a number of people on the other side, I'm not going to try to cite them all, I don't have time, felt that the source was foreign and had been imported with some of these with the French colonial immigrants from Santo Domingo. The resulting controversy actually caused a schism in the College of Physicians and ultimately led Rush to create an alternate body in Philadelphia, which was called the Academy of Medicine. And interestingly, no one suggested or implicated that all these mosquitoes, which were so prevalent in the community early on, might have played a role in this. Rush, the treatment that was certainly heroic, Rush promoted massive doses of calomel, which is mercury chloride, also known as blue mass, to purge the system, and it certainly did, it sounds like, and also heroic bleedings. And the reason they felt that bleedings were going to be beneficial was that a number of the people that died, their stomachs were full of blood, and so they figured, well, if we can get rid of all this blood, we might be able to help these people out. Some of the others recommended a less severe method, like red wine, lemonade, and a warm bath. And Rush's prominence as a physician actually led, in most cases, to his protocols being the one that were primarily advanced, although they certainly were not beneficial in a lot of cases, as you might imagine. And reading these accounts, the amount of mercury that these guys took, the whole city must have been mercury poisoned, everybody that got this. So how did this affect the Founding Fathers? Well, the Pennsylvania State Assembly stopped meeting in September and they all left town. Congress was not in session at that time, and the federal government actually had no authority to act in this crisis, nor did George Washington or anybody in the federal government have the authority to convene Congress and the federal government in a different location. Alexander Hamilton became sick and recovered. Thomas Jefferson left town. John Adams left town. The president, Washington, left for Mount Vernon on September 10th, and he didn't come back until the 1st of November. A lot of the federal employees and clerks fled, and bringing government business to a virtual standstill. There were a handful of federal officers that stayed there. The location of a lot of official documents became unclear. Whether they ended up on WikiLeaks or somewhere else, I don't know, or whatever the 18th century version of WikiLeaks was, I'm not sure. And one of the most incredible things was a number of important national business related to international affairs basically came to a halt. One of the things that was going on at that time was this right around the time of the French Revolution, and the French were making a very serious effort to get the United States involved in a European war on the side of the French. And there were, before the outbreak, a lot of demonstrations in Philadelphia where they were basically calling, a person by the name of Citizen Genet. Some of you may have heard that, the Citizen Genet affair. He was over there trying to foment interest in coming into the wars on the side of the French. And so there were a lot of demonstrations which were going on in the city of Philadelphia. And when chaos began to reign as part of the outbreak, those demonstrations ceased. So you can see there was a severe impact on government business. Some of the consequences were, it turns out that the chaos in Philadelphia may have prevented a political upheaval over the French Revolution because the demonstrators basically left town, and then after the outbreak was over, they didn't reconvene. President Washington at the time was very, very concerned and felt very strongly that the United States had no business getting into an international war at that time. And so probably this yellow fever outbreak had the effect of keeping us out of an international war. Philadelphia's luster as the U.S.'s most cosmopolitan city was seriously tarnished because of this yellow fever outbreak. And as a consequence, other cities became major seaports after this, Boston and New York. The schism in the Philadelphia medical community persisted after this. And Rush served as, he stayed in business, and he was actually the medical advisor to Meriwether Lewis, and Thomas Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis up to Philadelphia to consult to decide what kinds of medicines they should take on the Corps of Discovery when they went to explore the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, Rush recommended what came to be called as thunderclappers, which were these doses, these lethal doses of mercury. And they were, if you've read the Lewis and Clark journals, you know that these thunderclappers were used prolifically all the way up and down the Missouri River drainage. And an interesting sidelight is that the Lewis and Clark expedition was really a military expedition. So if you could find one spot associated with a particular encampment, because they were military installations, you can figure out where all the other parts were. And because of the amount of mercury that these guys consumed and deposited in the latrines, these led to a lot of what's called anomalous behavior in the soil. And a number of the Lewis and Clark campgrounds, particularly in Montana and a few other places, were identified by people looking for anomalous accumulations of heavy metal. Once they were able to find an anomalous accumulation of heavy metal, they could say, okay, here's where the latrine was, here's where the enlisted men were, here's where Lewis and Clark were, and here's where the sergeants were. So I guess that's one of the benefits of thunderclappers during that expedition. Philadelphia suffered a few more outbreaks of yellow fever in 1790, 97, 98, and 99, but they weren't of the extent or the severity of the one in 1793. And then finally, Congress first met in the District of Columbia in November of 1800. And with that, I just want to acknowledge a few people who helped me along this and get started in this. Victoria Harden, who's the director of the Office of NIH History and runs the Stetton Museum on the main campus, and Anita Mora, who's in our Visual Medical Arts program in Maryland. And my foray into history here, casual as it is, was supported by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease Intramural Program. And I've just listed here just a couple of citations. The Molly Caldwell Crosby's book is about the American plague. That's about yellow fever in the Mississippi River Basin. The J.H. Powell book, reprinted from 1949, reprinted in 1993, called Bring Out Your Dead, The Great Plague of Yellow Fever in Philadelphia, is a really, really interesting read. There's a lot of first-person accounts, and if you're interested, that's a really, really good one to start with. There was a great article in Pennsylvania History by Eve Cornfield called Crisis in the Capital, the Cultural Significance of Philadelphia's Great Yellow Fever Epidemic. And then the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia has a nice article in it by Simon Finger. And then I have to say, much to my chagrin, the article in Wikipedia and the associated references in Wikipedia are also really excellent. So it's really a terrific story, and if you're interested on the role of infectious diseases in history, some of these sources would be worth looking up. And with that, I'm done, and I'm going to turn it back to Ann. Thank you very much.
I think we'll wait and take questions at the end. I'll introduce our next speaker and take all the questions together at the end. But first, I'd really like a show of hands. How many people agree with me that Saffron Scourge would be an awesome name for a rock band? We just don't name diseases that, I mean, MERS, it just doesn't, doesn't rate. I'd like to introduce our second speaker tonight. Dr. Douglas Beecher is with the FBI. He got his PhD in microbiology from Rutgers, and those of you who were at our last Microbes After Hours on microbiology and the emerging bioeconomy might remember Dr. Ramaswamy, and he did his graduate work right down the hall from Doug at Rutgers. So we got a little Rutgers thing going on here, New Jersey, microbiology happening. He studied Bacillus cereus for his PhD, and then he moved to Clostridium botulinum for his postdoc. He really likes those really fun bugs. And then went back to Bacillus cereus at Madison from 1992 to 2000 when he joined the FBI and received the coolest job title ever, crime scene microbiologist. And I, for one, am looking forward to the Law and Order Special Microbes Unit be coming soon, and Doug is going to tell us who's going to play him on that show. But more seriously, Dr. Beecher was involved in the investigation of the Anthrax attacks in 2001, right from the very beginning of those investigations until they were closed. And he pioneered the use of basic microbiological techniques at crime scenes. And he'll be telling us something about that. He designed sampling methods that located the anthrax attack letter addressed to Senator Leahy. He resolved contradictory witness statements about events at the first attack site and verified the location of the mailings. And now he's the lead scientist in the Scientific Response Unit, and he continues to build this capability of crime scene investigations for microbiological evidence. So we're really looking forward to your talk, Dr. Beecher.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me, Marshall. I have to say, it is the very first time I've ever been compared to Madonna. I'm sure she doesn't suffer from the on-camera shiny head syndrome, but anyway, I'm grateful to be here. I was asked to talk a little bit about the 2001 anthrax attacks in keeping with the microbe shutting down government theme. And I want to remind everyone that this case had 22 victims, 22 cases of anthrax and 5 dead. But trying to figure out what the effect on government actually is pretty difficult. No one's actually put together an accounting of what happened. The most we can do is at the moment, is look at the contamination that occurred. And by that account, all branches of government were affected. They had to deal with buildings being either tested or decontaminated. Obviously, postal system was hardest hit. Capitol Hill was hit pretty hard. The Senate and House both had 2 office buildings closed. The Hart Senate office building was closed for 3 months before it could be reoccupied. It's moving forward. Cleanup cost by one estimate was $320 million, and that's just the cleanup, so that's only a fraction of the actual cost of the case. But what I want to focus on today really is the legacy of those letters, the continual disruption of local, state, and federal government by what has come to be known as white powder letters. Our unit has to deal with these continually. We deal with several a week. The FBI has been dealing with powdered anthrax threats since 1998. To give you an idea of the scope of the problem, this USA Today article, this quote from 2008, estimated 30,000 incidents involving suspicious powders that required a response. And they went on to say that this is the terrifying legacy of the anthrax attacks of 9/11. Well, for me, someone who deals with these continually, the terrifying is less accurate than irritating. And I say that because it's been 15 years, and in 15 years of these powders, there hasn't been a single injury from any one of them except for those anthrax letters. And it's disappointing that we're still having to deal with these, each one as if it is real. And to understand why, we have to kind of look at where it started and how we got to where we are. My first question to ask about that is, why even white powder letters? Who came up with this idea that anthrax is a powder and put it in an envelope? It's the epitome of a bad weapon design. If you open a powdered letter, most of it's going to fall to the floor or stay inside. So from a weapons perspective, it's all wasted. Another thing is that these all have a common feature in that they warn the victim, which doesn't seem to make sense, especially when your threat is anthrax. And you have plenty of time to get treatment and not even get hurt. Now, of course, it does make sense if you have absolutely no ability to hurt anyone with spores, and it's the only way you can get a response is by making this kind of a threat, using that scary word anthrax. Now, the first association I could find of anthrax in the mail was actually only 7 blocks from here at the B'nai B'rith International headquarters. They received a package. It didn't contain a powder, but it contained a Petri dish, which we can all associate with bacteria, and it was labeled anthrax. But it was actually spelled this way. It was spelled wrong. So this should decrease the credibility of this event, because you would guess that someone who could obtain, grow, and mail Bacillus anthracis without killing themselves could also spell the word. But people don't think that way. This is clearly a threat. It's a scary word, even if it's spelled wrong. So you get a full-blown response, and this resulted in shutting down part of the city. Employees were quarantined, decontaminated. And what I mean by that is stripped down and hosed off. So it's an unpleasant experience, very expensive. And this happened 11 months before the first actual powder letter that I could find. And I was wondering what happened in this country to maybe spur that. And I looked at newspaper articles that contained the word anthrax in that time period. So this is the number of articles in the newslibrary.com database. And you can see where the B'nai B'rith event happened in April of '97. Well, something happened between there and that little red arrow. That's the first mailing of powder that I could associate with anthrax. Something clearly happened to get anthrax in the news. It became a big story. And basically what was going on was that Iraq was playing games with weapons inspectors and kicking them out, and this creates a big story. The Department of Defense announced a program to vaccinate 100% of their personnel against anthrax, and then there were arrests associated with Bacillus anthracis. So in supporting the introduction of this vaccination program, the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, went on television, and he held up this 5-pound bag of Domino's sugar. And he wanted to give us some sort of visual so that we could understand just how scary anthrax is. And he said, call this anthrax. If this were spread over a city the size of Washington, D.C., it would kill half the population. Well, that is scary. But looking back and realizing that all of these letters that we have to deal with, all these powders, they're almost always household powders. So this is kind of an unfortunate image. It gave an image of anthrax as something visible in your kitchen. Now, this arrest regarding Bacillus anthracis was Larry Wayne Harris and William Levitt. Basically, an informant came to the FBI and said, hey, these guys have weapons-grade anthrax, and they can kill like millions of people. So the FBI went and arrested them, and in fact, they did have Bacillus anthracis. But it was a veterinary strain of vaccine, and it's perfectly legal to have, and they never filed charges. But despite that, it was a big news story. So these are in white, the stories in the paper about Iraq and anthrax, and the yellow is about this arrest, and you can see that it's about the same. But more important than the numbers here is the change in the conversation about anthrax in this country. You started to see this term terrorist associated with this term anthrax, and it's what the red is. Oh, sorry. And it was with articles like this, with titles like this: Chemistry, Biology hold promise for terrorists. Anthrax scare illustrates how easily terrorists could obtain lethal toxins. And of course, it didn't actually show that, but they didn't just make this up. They got their information from experts who, of course, are happy to share their knowledge with us. And they told us that anthrax is a brownish material. It would be inhalable, and it would be kind of like talcum powder. But not only were they confirming how it looked, but how easy it was to do. Basically, you could do it in your garage, according to them. A college student with a few $1,000s can make a weapon of mass destruction. And this last quote, disappointingly, was by a noted microbiologist who said that, it's so easy that a child could do it, and that's an unfortunate statement. So the first actual powder threat that I could find occurred only days after these articles appeared in the press, and it was at SecureCode Recovery Technologies. It was a bill payment. Interestingly enough, it had the payment in full with the guy's check with his name and everything. So, but it also had black and white powder and a threatening message, and it had the same effect as in D.C. It was a big, full-time or full-scale response. Employees quarantined, building closed for 4 days, people given antibiotics, and so on. And this is what was in that message: you SOB, you've been exposed to anthrax spores, and a standard pestilence on your family. That's spelled wrong. So, it's not a real credible threat. But even making it less credible was what's on the outside of the letter, which is the guy put his actual name, his address, his apartment number, and his zip +4, which I have never used in my life. So the credibility goes down. But FBI sees these as really pretty decent clues, and they show up to this address, and there's the guy, and he admits it. I did it. But, it was just a joke. Well, when the FBI showed up to arrest him, they were wearing full protective equipment. They shut down his apartment building. That is this fright that anthrax, the word, puts into people, and that's what we still deal with today. Now, one has to wonder how this guy, you can tell he's not brilliant just from the structure of this thread, how did he come up with the idea that really would change how things are done, that really replaced the bomb threat with the white powder letter? And I don't know how that happened. I don't know exactly what it was that set him off. But the next powder threat that I could find was that same year in August at Wichita, Kansas, the Finney State Office Building. It received this message, and it's full of misspellings. It calls it the terminal virus, Bacillus cutaneus anthracis, and then it goes out of its way to assure us that this is not a joke, right? Which pretty much tells us it's a joke. But regardless of how non-credible this is, there's a full response. 200 people evacuated. Now, I know a guy who is on this response. He entered that building in full personal protective equipment. They shut down the HVAC system. It's 95 degrees outside. So these people are putting themselves in harm's way and creating a hazardous environment just by being in that heat in order to respond to these things, and that's basically how it goes. Well, only a few months later, in October of that year, the FBI had its first major case that involved anthrax and powders. And it was originally started out as a hoax bombing case to abortion clinics, and someone was sending actual hoax devices. They noticed apparently that they weren't getting any press at all. They weren't barely shutting down the building. And they must have noticed that these powders were having a big response, both in the press and by scaring the hell out of people. So they changed to letters, and by the end they sent over 110 letters and several serial mass mailings to clinics. And they got around it by changing up the appearance of the letters so that people would open it with subsequent mailings. So the first, there's no return address on the first set of mailings. Next one, there's a phony Laboratories as the mailings, and so on. Well, this continued to grow. Not just that case, but the phenomenon grew. There were copycats. In the first few months of the phenomenon, there were 3,000 people affected, according to the New York Times. And that grew to 13,000 by August of that year, and it continued to grow. So when I arrived in 2000 to the FBI, it was already a significant problem. And as the previous slides would suggest, these letters had a kind of a stereotype. And the post office puts out information flyers on how to recognize these things. And they have commonalities like no return address, misspelled words, they're badly typed or written, or excessive tape. Well, then in 2001, in September and October, these letters showed up in the mail. Well, these letters changed everything. They changed the way we do things now. And they changed everything because they had actual Bacillus anthracis spores in them. And I look at those and I look at what a game changer that was. But despite that, you're looking at the same thing we've already seen over and over. There's no return address on the first mailing. There's a return address on the second. Tape all around the edges, all around the flaps. The letters themselves, blocky letters, they're badly written. They warn the victim. Now here you have actual spores. You don't have a need to warn the victim, but they did anyway. And why do you have to do that? One reason might be if you're following a script and making it look purposely like the other letters, right down to the sort of standout feature of the misspelled word, the word penicillin. Why that word in particular? One of the sets of powders that was mailed out was absolutely pure spores. And it takes a lot of training to do that. It's a high-tech material. Well, how does that person not know how to spell penicillin unless they did it on purpose? Well, I looked at those letters, and I thought, this just gives me a funny feeling, and I never could figure out how these letters look so unsophisticated, and yet they were associated with such sophisticated material. And a friend of mine came close to figuring out what was happening, and he looked at these letters. An FBI agent happens to have a PhD in biochemistry, and he's looking at these letters, and he sees something that other people see, but he's seeing it differently. He's seeing it from a biologist's perspective. There's letters bolded in this on purpose. Well, he's seeing that they're all A's and T's, and for a biologist, what's significant about that? They're part of DNA, yeah? So adenine and thymine, guanine and cytosine. And he saw this as a code. Well, DNA is a code. And there's 9 of these. If you put them together, they're written into codes, into series of 3. 3 bases in a row is a codon. The codons code for the amino acid sequence that goes into a protein. And these codons code for phenylalanine, asparagine, and tyrosine. Now, the Department of Justice Anthrax Investigative Summary, which is online, it's on the DOJ website, you can search for it and see it, they suggest that the first letters of these amino acids were significant to the mailer. But with amino acids, you can take it an additional level. They have, in addition to the 3-letter code, they have single-letter designators. And sometimes they're not the same as the first letter. For example, phenylalanine you'd expect to be P, but proline is using that. So they gave that an F. Asparagine is N, and tyrosine is Y. Now, this investigative summary also suggests that this is a disparaging comment to New York, the city that received it. So the New York, I'll let you translate the F part. So right down to this phony spelling, this phony misspelling, this is actually a sophisticated device. It's not unsophisticated at all. The I was changed in penicillin to an A, which also was used in that TNA code. So this, to me, seems like someone saying, hey, you know, I'm smart. I'm smarter than these dimwits who send these letters, but deal with this. And then finally, it kind of makes sense to me. Why these letters look so unsophisticated? Well, it was very thought out. If it had been a sophisticated device, something that put anthrax into a cloud and killed lots of people, that's a limited thing that very, very few people could do. It would be a self-limiting threat. But here's where the cleverness that I think was in this. By tagging on to this phenomenon that's perpetuated by dimwits, basically, and isn't going to stop, you get credibility. Now, one of the motives in this case, in the DOJ summary, was that this was a financial motive, that an anthrax attack would benefit the sender. So by doing this, you give credibility to every sloppy, misspelled threat out there. And that's why today we're dealing with these as if each one is real. So that's the problem framed. It exists today, and the next phase is to solve it, but I don't have any. We're willing to take suggestions on that, and that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. Oh, fascinating talk. So we have a microphone for each of you, and we can start taking questions now. There's a microphone over here if you're in the room and you want to ask a question, and I believe we have someone, if there's anybody in the overflow room, we have someone who'll bring questions to us. Anybody have a question? Shannon, do we have any? Oh.
I actually have a question about the Mercury.
Yeah, would you mind coming to the microphone so the people who are not here can?
Ma'am?
I have a question about the Mercury. It sort of caught my eye that it seemed to be so widely used and we now know does such damage. What was it that Mercury did that would cause Benjamin Rush to think that was the answer to heaven only knows how many ailments? And what did it really do?
Well, I'm not an expert I'm not a toxicologist either, but it provokes this very, very impressive diarrhea. And among the other thing, if you get enough of it, it makes you salivate. And why they felt that, and so it was the idea, if you've got bad humors, I guess, you have bad humors and things in you, the idea is let's get it out of you. And if the bad humors are in your intestines, and if you read the Lewis and Clay, they had food poisoning probably from the time they left St. Louis to the time they got back to St. Louis. They had food poisoning, and the purgative effect of the mercury was thought to be beneficial. I think that's right. Close to right.
Shannon, are there any questions from
Not yet.
the chat room?
So I have two questions. You said that there were further outbreaks in Philadelphia in subsequent years, not simultaneous years. What is it about Philadelphia? There are mosquitoes everywhere. Probably you seem to discount the Santo Domingo idea. So what's known about the mechanisms that would implicate Philadelphia as being special?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I mean, probably and there had been a number of outbreaks prior to this one, but for some reason this one just really exploded and caused all the difficulty. The subsequent ones weren't as bad, and maybe the reason was that that there are probably a lot of people that caught yellow fever that didn't die from it. And so there may have been some level of herd immunity, or wasn't able to get rip snorting as it was. But the other thing, and I kind of glossed over this, is that there were outbreaks all the way up and down the Mississippi River basin. And one of the scariest things, I think, is that now, I can't remember where I read this on ProMed or somewhere, that people are now starting to find Aedes aegypti back in the United States. So we may be ready for another round of yellow fever. And, and it really, that question really broaches one of the major issues in emerging infectious diseases is, why do they wax and why do they wane? And I think one of the reasons that a lot of these virus infections like dengue and maybe yellow fever and some of these other ones are starting to wax into the northern hemisphere is as a result of climate change. The boundary between temperate and tropical zones is becoming a little bit blurred, and that vectors and pathogens, which were previously confined to more tropical regions, may now find areas, in the United States more hospitable. And there's examples not only with viruses. I mean, Chagas disease, which is a parasite, that now seems to be, creeping north. So, we'll see. I mean, we might get yellow fever again. I mean, there's outbreaks now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's not a vanished disease.
Well, it relates to my second question, which is whether there are some object lessons in it's sort of fun to make fun of the way that the recommendations that were used for treatment back then. But I just wonder if we're doing any of the same thing now with diseases that we don't understand, mechanisms that we don't understand, and if there are lessons that we can take from the kinds of things that we should be doing to avoid some of the advice that we were laughing at in this.
Absolutely. I mean, my favorite definition of science is dynamic ignorance. Is that, everything that's been done was all done in the name of science and the best knowledge available. And what we don't, and so I'm sure a lot of the stuff that we're doing today, I mean, I think about the times when I was back in medical school, some of the things we did, to patients with neurological disease at that time. I mean, they sound like the Star Chamber during the Spanish Inquisition. So absolutely, we'll be equally ridiculed in 200 years.
I thought your comments about the perpetrators of the anthrax hoax very, very interesting. Having dealt with many of these so-called white powder incidents at the state level, the amount of resources that go into investigating each and every one, the laboratory efforts to look to see whether or not you've really got something of significance is, certainly clearly has an economic impact. And at this point, how many years we are after 2001, we hear less about this, so I don't know that these have diminished, but is there any better way of predicting which of these letters and hoaxes or whatever have got some sort of predictability so that you can or can't ignore each and every one of these Dunkin' Donut bags that have white powder in them?
Yeah, well, yeah, so there is a way. Unfortunately, it takes experience, and I look at something and I can tell. I just, I know, I've been around long enough that I understand that it's not an issue. The trick is getting that into the hands of responders. And I don't see it ever happening. There's too much turnover. There's too much ignorance about it. So without the sort of experts there right at the beginning, it's going to keep happening. And we do get into it at some point, but we're investigative. So how do you predict it? I don't know. And it's just a shame that those anthrax attacks, I think if they hadn't happened, we might have just been bored by now. We might have been tired of it and just not paid attention. But now we're getting ricin. Well, these people are stepping it up. It's not really particularly dangerous what they're doing, but they think it is. And that's kind of scary.
It's like Tony Fauci, our institute director, always says, you don't need a lot of bio to make a lot of terror.
So I have a question, Doug. Is there any, would there be any possibility of a public campaign to say something about how unlikely it is these are to be real? With that, is there, in other words, is there any way to deter the people who you're saying are really not very well educated, who are, there's no way in the world they'd have the capability to really make anthrax that would be dangerous? Is there any way to get them to think this is a stupid kind of hoax to run, that it's not going to get any attention or it's not going to shut anything down?
Yeah, I'm not the person really to ask about public campaigns. They probably want to keep me from saying very much at all. But anyway, I think we do need some venue to demonstrate that this is going on and what it actually means. And we don't, frankly, do a decent job of communicating. We don't have a sort of publication venue, if you will. And our efforts so far have been to go around to local fire stations, hazmat meetings, laboratory response network, or clinical laboratories, and try to get the word out, and it doesn't seem to work. We've been doing it for years, and it doesn't seem to affect how it changes. And that's one reason I come to places like this, is to get this information out, and maybe we can get people thinking about it from a public communication perspective.
Yeah. I certainly had no idea that this was so common, and yet it only was real one time.
Well, every time it happens locally, it's a big deal, and it's a big deal to the firemen. We deal with it, our unit, nationally, and it is common, and it's been going on for a long time.
So to come at that from a slightly different perspective, as somebody who lives now on a campus in an agricultural state where you were trained, we all know that anthrax takes a lot of cows down, and we have cows buried on campus for 70 years. And after these incidents happened, we had a lot of people coming to us saying, is it safe to be in that area, which used to be farmland, that is now a very nice prominent part of a campus that you know a lot about? And how do you, it's educating the people as well as educating the first responders and everything else, that it's okay to go hang out on the lake where they buried the cows 90 years ago when the herd went down. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that patch, having been at Wisconsin, and it's a famous sort of story. But
well, I mean, we had an enormous press coverage of that patch after 9/11.
Yeah. It's hard to say how to really teach people what's rational and what's real. More than they're trusting people. They're trusting you to tell them that it is safe. But the sort of strongest thing we can say is, look, it's been around forever. No one's dying. No one's getting this. And it's the same thing with the ricin situation now. We've never even had an injury from that material that wasn't self-inflicted. So how do you get it out when the press especially is out there telling us how horrible it is? So I don't know. I'm not a communications expert.
Any other questions? Shannon, anything coming in from online? Oh, you do? Go. Yeah. Great.
So I know that you said there were 2 letters that contained actual anthrax spores, and you said that one had the coded sequence with the DNA and the proteins or whatever. Did the other letter also contain any kind of coded message?
Yeah, we actually recovered 4 letters. I just gave the 2 examples because there were 2 mailings that we know of. There's at least a 5th letter that we are clear about because of sampling. But no one's found another message in the other one. That one, the second one, contained the pure spores that tells us it's high tech.
So that was a bio major.
This is our last Microbes After Hours for the summer. We'll be reconvening in October with a session on the microbiology of beer. RSVP early because I'm sure it will be packed. If you can't wait to learn a little bit about the microbiology of beer, I think we have some copies out in the lobby of our recent frequently asked questions on the microbiology of beer that's entitled, "If the Yeast Ain't Happy, Ain't Nobody Happy." And we're really looking forward to that. And you can also read it online if there aren't any copies left at the American Academy of Microbiology website. You'll also find there all of our other frequently asked questions, brochures on topics ranging from microbes and oil spills to West Nile virus. I encourage you to look around there and join us again in October. And could you join me in thanking our speakers one more time?
Zero is a number. Zero or now. Right.
Once you're in the BSL-4 space, the only way you can get out is to go through a chemical shock.
It's an unusual room. Never seen anything like this. Anybody who has access to this facility first has to go through an R scan. So the HEPA filters filter the air coming out of the facility, and that will remove bacteria, viruses, anything that might constitute any kind of risk, right? Remember, this building is basically a second building inside the main building.